welcome back to Halloween House. So this is part 2 on the prolific serial killer, Rodney Alcala. He's also known as the dating game killer.
In our last video, we talked about his first known crimes and his childhood. And if you did miss that video, we're going to post the link in the descriptions of this one.
Yes. So we left off with Rodney escaping the LAPD after his brutal attack on Tally Shapiro, and at this point in our story, he is now a fugitive and living as John Berger in New York City.
So in September of 1968, he enrolled using this new alias, John Berger, in New York at New York University in the arts program, and he was working on his second bachelor's degree. He was a student of Roman Polanski.
Yes, husband of Sharon Tate. So in 1971, he's considered what is considered to be his first murder. We both have doubts on this because considering his brutal attack on Morgan and Tally,
he probably did something.
Yeah, and at this point he had his cross-country hitchhiking trip from North Carolina back to LA. So there's plenty of opportunities for him to commit other crimes, but
he just hasn't had a pin on him.
Right. But this is considered his first murder.
So Cornelia Crilley was born in 1948, and she grew up in Queens, New York. She had 2 sisters and 2 brothers.
And she was a beautiful woman of Irish descent. She had long black hair and blue eyes.
And her friends and family described her as funny and very friendly. And when she was accepted to become a TWA flight attendant, she decided it was time to get an apartment in East Manhattan. And at that time, the area was referred to as the Girl Belts.
Yes. It was an interesting time in history when young women were just beginning to live on their own and enjoy their own careers. In the not too distant past, most, not of course all, but most women typically graduated high school, got married, and became housewives and mothers.
And if they did go to college, it was kind of jokingly referred to as working on their MRS, their Mrs.
Yes, they went to college to find a husband, not necessarily for a degree.
Yes.
And we're not saying all women,
no,
but
it was just kind of a common progression at that point.
Yes,
and
yes.
We've moved on from there.
Yes, we have. So on June 24th, 1971, just days after moving into her new apartment, Cornelia's mother, she became concerned when she couldn't get in touch with her daughter on the telephone. So she did contact Cornelia's current boyfriend, and he went to her apartment to check on her.
And there was no answer. So he notified the police, and they gained entry by breaking into a back window. And sadly, she was found strangled. She'd been strangled with a pair of her own nylons. She was nude with multiple bite wounds on her breasts.
Yes, and I'd like to add, we aren't adding that detail to be gratuitous, but it's important to remember when we get much further along in the story.
And they didn't believe it was robbery as a motive, because nothing of value was taken. There were not signs of forced entry, and the door was locked when the boyfriend showed up.
Yeah, it is now believed that Alcala charmed her into allowing him to help her move some furniture into her new apartment.
And at this point in time, New York was a very gritty place to be. There were over 2,000 murders that year. The police were really overwhelmed, and they had no evidence or leads in this case.
So sadly, the case would go cold for 40 years.
Meanwhile, back in California, which, again, this is 1971, so it's 3 years after he attacked Tally, the authorities finally got the FBI to add him to the America's Most Wanted list.
Yes. And now, while Rodney Alcala, under the alias of John Berger, is a student at New York University, he's spending his summers working as a drama counselor at a drama camp in George Mills, New Hampshire.
And 2 of the girls from this camp had visited the local post office. And it was raining out, so instead of just popping in and popping out, they decided to wait a few minutes to see if maybe that rain would let up a little bit.
Yes. So this is when they noticed a flyer from the FBI with Mr. Berger's
His
photo on it. And so they went back and they did tell another camp counselor about him. He says, "Okay, keep quiet about it. I'm gonna go check this out."
And thankfully, this adult listened to these girls.
Yes.
Because even now, a lot of adults don't always take things seriously, but back then, especially, I mean, we already talked about the police officer not taking
Morgan, I'm so sorry, Morgan, seriously.
So,
yeah.
The counselor went there, and he looks at this photo, and he sees John Berger.
Yes.
So he contacted the authorities.
Yes. And on August 11th, 1971, authorities arrived at the camp to arrest Rodney Alcala, and he is extradited to California to finally face charges on his attack on Tally, for his attack on Tally.
Yeah, at this point, Tally and her parents were living in Mexico. Her parents, they didn't want Tally to come and testify at the trial. So he ended up only being convicted on one count of child molestation.
Yes, and he was sentenced to an indeterminate sentence with the option of parole. This meant that he would be released when he proved himself to be rehabilitated.
Whatever that means. He was released in 1974, serving 34 months. So I guess they gave him a little bit of time to rehabilitate himself. He was placed on parole and had to register as a sex offender.
Which, registering as a sex offender at this time basically meant nothing. Yeah. There was no internet or anything. What is the average citizen going to go do? Go to the police department and say, "Who's a registered sex offender?" It basically meant absolutely nothing at the time. So, on October 13th, 1974, he, after he's on parole for the attack on Tally, he kidnapped a 13-year-old girl, and she's only known as Julie J. And he forced her to smoke marijuana, and he was kissing her, and an alert park manager intervened.
That park ranger probably saved her life.
Absolutely. Again, he was only charged and convicted of much lesser charges, this time for providing drugs to a minor and violating parole. So, he was given another indeterminate sentence. He served 2 years before being released on parole, having been deemed reformed. Again. Ridiculous.
1977, he asked his parole officer for permission to visit his family in New York City. Parole officer approved, and Rodney Alcala, once again, was back in New York City.
Yes, this parole officer who is well aware of Rodney's past. Yeah.
Back in the day, I don't know what they were all thinking.
Unreal. So we will leave off with Rodney Alcala back in New York City. Thank you for watching, and we will be back with part 3, and we'll be discussing the crimes he committed on his second visit to New York that we know of, and his crimes on his cross-country trip from New York City back to LA.
Stay tuned. Hit the subscribe button.
And as always, stay spooky.